Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. The Broadband Bunch Zero Touch Learning Series is live. Thanks so much for joining us. I'm Craig Corbin. Today's session, yes, fiber networks are still being built, is the fifth in our series. All previous sessions have been recorded for posterity and are available on our website. You'll also find a listing of all future topics there as well. The Broadband Bunch podcast and Zero Touch Learning Series events, all brought to you, as always, by ETI Software, a proud member of the Fiber Broadband Association. And be sure to follow the Broadband Bunch on Facebook at www.facebook.com/the Broadband Bunch. A couple of quick reminders before we introduce our esteemed panel. All Broadband Bunch Learning Series events are most definitely designed to be interactive. We encourage you to submit questions via the chat function. Our team will be monitoring all submissions throughout today's event. The session is being recorded and will be available to all attendees for future access. Also, please feel free to submit potential topics for future Zero Touch Learning Series sessions, or if you'd like to suggest prospective panelists. And again, you can do that via the chat function. And thanks in advance for your participation. Well, today's topic, no doubt, very timely, especially given the increased demand for connectivity as a result of the unprecedented challenges we're all facing. Our panelists are standing by in their introduction straight ahead. But first, it is my privilege to introduce our moderator, Heather Gold, currently CEO of HBG Strategy and a 30-year veteran of the communications industry. She previously served as president and CEO of the Fiber Broadband Association, following her tenure as senior vice president of external affairs and access management for EXO Communications. Heather graduated magna cum laude from Tufts University with bachelor's and master's degrees in economics, later earning an MBA in finance and marketing from Washington University in St. Louis. Our moderator for Yes, Fiber Networks Are Still Being Built, Heather Gold. Heather?
Thanks, Craig, and good afternoon to my great panel. With the pandemic, as Craig just said, with the pandemic on the rise across the country and the critical need for ultra high bandwidth growing as fast as the virus, the critical question remains, can we still build? Yes, the answer is unequivocally yes. And today's group of experts can deliver the real answers on how and why they continue to build and what they are seeing in projects that are still underway. They represent all aspects of the fiber builder, from the provider who is meeting that demand to the vendors who are supplying the upfront and back-end connectivity. So with that, let me quickly introduce our panelists, and I will turn it over to the first speaker. Leading us off today is Jason Pond, who is the co-founder and CEO of Grizzly Broadband, a telecommunications provider located in Missoula and the Bitterroot Valley in western Montana. And then we'll hear from Jeff Ryman, who is a VP of the Broadband Group, who helps municipals, communities, and utilities do their feasibility and build out strategy. Next, we have Chris Bresner, the VP of Product Marketing for ETI Solutions, where his expertise is in use billing and OSS applications, specializing in service activation interfaces, which is critical. And last but certainly not least, we're going to hear from Carl Meyerhofer from Calix, a leading equipment vendor supplying rural and cooperative market. Carl has global responsibility for marketing and positioning of their solutions into the fiber innovative segment, of which all of us are a part. And with that, Jason, lead us off.
Thank you, Heather. And good afternoon to everybody, or good morning in some time zones. We're asked to talk a little bit today about how we're still building. We're a telecommunications company in western Montana. We do fixed wireless and fiber to the home. And over the course of the past 20 years of building fixed wireless, we've asked ourselves the question of what maybe we should be building fiber instead. So we started this journey into fiber to the home about 5 years ago and came up with this the big question of how do we get ahead of the curve? Wireless and fixed wireless is a fantastic product. It has got us into the ISP and broadband spaces. So, but the curve or the standard is the same. Every 4 years, there's an upgrade cycle. And without reverse compatibility, it gives us the ability or the inability to quickly upgrade without a whole bunch of operating expenses. So as we looked into wireless versus fiber, we looked at the time frames involved and also some of the exposure that we have when we go into wireless. And so that brings up to some interference issues. You can go to the next slide. Over the years, we've done wireless. The wireless networks have gone from 802.11b, GN, AC, all the way up through the latest protocol, which is now out, and then their branding is Wi-Fi 6. Every single time they do an upgrade, they're looking for more frequency. The products are coming out on the shelf, and it's making it very difficult to continue in a fixed wireless space. You get anybody can go down to the local retail store and buy a point-to-point link and put it up, and all of a sudden create an interference problem, which is just mitigated when you start looking at fiber. We can go to the next slide. The cost to upgrade the wireless network, albeit wireless equipment is a lot less expensive than putting fiber into the ground or even overhead. The challenges that we run into is that we have to forklift the entire network. And so if you've got a network of 1,000 customers and you have to all of a sudden upgrade your whole tower or all the towers, you've got all the access points plus all the customers, and you have to touch every customer every 4 to 5 years. And this upgrade cycle was just becoming very difficult to go with. So we needed to look into something else that we could build and that would not require us to go out to every single customer's house at the end of it. So we looked at this over a 20-year picture and started to realize that building a fiber network was actually a better answer. You know, once you put the fiber in the ground, the fiber's good for as long as it can last. I mean, there's really no degradation. There's fiber today that's being used from 1974 when it was first put in the UK. So we also looked at operating expenses over time and did a bunch of research with various different companies that had been doing fiber to the home over the years, and looked at that and said, you know what? Yeah, it's a high CapEx up front, but our operating expenses over a 20-year picture are far less than running any part of a fixed wireless network. So we took that journey to go down building fiber to the home. And one thing, you can go next slide. One thing that came very, very certain to us was when COVID hit, and all of a sudden, in a matter of a week, they shut down the entire country. I mean, we went from California being closed to now everywhere being closed. We got a call on a Sunday afternoon saying schools were closed for the next week, and then it was uncertain as to what was going to happen from there. It ended up being they were closed for the rest of the year, but within 1 week, we saw a 30% increase in our upload traffic. Well, on a wireless network, that's quite substantial. It starts eating up into a lot of frame time. Schools, you know, they went from being, and businesses went from working in the office to working from home, and all of that video content. We were scrambling. Our phones started ringing off the hook for people that were just running off a cellular or didn't have good internet at their house. Maybe they had a slower upload on their copper connection. We had a 300% increase almost overnight of install requests, and went from being where we could handle, you know, 2 days out for an install to where all of a sudden we were 4 weeks out. I mean, it was just overnight, immediate. It was really the biggest challenge of it was being able to handle this, what we knew was a temporary demand. It was a surge that we knew was going to end. So being able to staff that, it was impossible to train a field technician and bring on new staff. So we just everybody who had experience put together the belts and we started going for it. We can go to the next slide. All of a sudden, new safety protocols became a major issue. We had to get additional PPE or personal protective equipment, and then we had to train on it. It wasn't something you can just hand out. Not very many people have experience using masks, proper use of gloves. So this became through, and then we continuously, through our leadership team in our company, we did daily and weekly communications to kind of pump up the team that we're going to make it through this. It's going to be busy and we're going to get through it, and we managed. It was a very stressful time. You had all of the media coming out of how bad COVID is, and then you had all the customer demands that I'm going to lose my job if I don't get my internet hooked up at my house today. And then the safety of our field technicians, the safety of our staff, and went through some of those protocols and changes, and even exercise a lot of them still today. Next slide. No matter how you look at it, video has become the new norm. As much as nobody wants to hear about the new normal, it is a thing, and HD video is not just the problem. 4K is the next evolution, and a lot of people have 4K cameras. Some are being built into cell phones now. That upload demand that is there is not something we'd ever accounted for, even in building infrastructure. And this is where fiber is making the most sense, because now with that 30% increase in upload, we can handle all the fiber network, or the fiber can handle all of the bandwidth demands that are needed, and still be able to grow and scale the way that we want to. Because let's face it, I was sitting there thinking about this back in 2005. A 512K connection was great 15 years ago. That worked out fantastic. We were still running things off of T1 lines. Now, we're talking 100 meg connections can barely cut what we really need to be able to do, especially if you're running 4K video. Next slide. So as we started to look at how this has played out, and the technology that we've invested in, and changing wireless to fiber and building fiber to the home, we feel very validated that we've made the right path. Fiber to the home is being constructed. We're continuing. Our construction crews feel safe. They're outside, and we continue to build fiber to the home. And looking at new markets every day. Our sales team is out talking to people and figuring out where the demand is to build fiber to the home, so that we can supply the demand just in case schools for some reason don't open up again in the fall. We're able to handle the demand of the bandwidth needed to every house. I think that's what I got. Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Jason. Jeff. Jeff, you're on mute.
Setting my timer there to make sure I stay within my allotted roughly 10 minutes. Jeff Ryman from the Broadband Group. Thank you for the introduction, Heather, and for the opportunity to participate on this important webinar. Broadband Group, we're based in Las Vegas, Nevada, consultant advisory firm working with cities, electric utilities, large-scale master plan communities on broadband deployment strategies. We work on the business side, the engineering side, and then if an entity chooses to construction management side of the fiber networks. Next slide. So we talk about the reason we're here today, and that's the reality of the telecommunications industry today. The market is effectively inefficient. There is significant demand that is not being made by the private enterprise, and that's understandable for a number of reasons. But first, consolidation has reduced competition. The consolidation of the telecommunications industry has been very good for the service providers, not good for those that are outside the top 25 markets around the country, and even within the top 25 markets. If you happen to be in an area that a service provider chooses is not going to be profitable enough for them, you're likely left with inadequate connectivity, which in this isolated environment in which we live is not only inconvenient, it's unacceptable, and what is often said when it comes to what is referred to as the homework gap, it's simply cruel. Action needs to be taken. The incumbent providers, they have significant advantage. A barrier of entry for new broadband service providers to enter our market is often prohibitive. And also, providers typically deploy networks that meet their interests, not necessarily that advance the interests or the understanding or the vision of a city or an area in which they serve. And by the way, that's inefficient for all providers, for the service providers, as well as for the markets that they serve. That disconnect in understanding how to build more efficient networks. Next slide, please. Why are they not being upgraded today? Of course, a lack of competition, but also the inefficient way in which networks are being built. Currently, you're having independent networks being built, sometimes side by side, often delivering the same level of service. Very little differentiation between a service provider. At the same time, you have electric utilities also building communication networks for their own internal needs. Sometimes cities are building communication networks for their internal needs. Often it's the traffic department. At the Broadband Group, we have worked to identify an approach that makes the build out of fiber networks more efficient, advancing the connectivity needs of a city, of a utility, while also lowering the traditional barrier of entry for a qualified service provider to enter a market, or for the incumbent service providers to utilize to provide improved services citywide. Next slide, please. That model is referred to as the utility lease model. The two highest profile deployments, Huntsville, Alabama, where the electric utility building out 1,000 miles of fiber for their own internal operational needs. So what happened was, up front, the electric utility knew that they needed more fiber in their network. It had to happen. Everything from the smart grid, grid modernization, grid of the future thesis. They needed more fiber in their network. However, they designed that network and deployed that network with additional capacity and allowed for a qualified anchor tenant to then lease access to deliver the services to the residents and businesses throughout the city of Huntsville. It allowed the utility to focus on its core competency and then find a qualified service provider to do what it does best, which is deliver those services, gigabit fiber services in the case of Huntsville, to the residents and businesses. That 1,000-mile fiber network build is about 98% complete. I say 98%, I think we'll announce some completion here in the next couple of months. All the homes in Huntsville now have access to Google Fiber. Of course, when Google Fiber announced their entrance into that city, the incumbents miraculously found more dough for them to upgrade their network to be able to maintain a level of competition for that new market entrance. In Springfield, Missouri, almost the exact same build in terms of size and scale, 1,000 miles of fiber. In that case, it's CenturyLink that is the anchor tenant. That's important for a couple of reasons. There's often the perception that the incumbents are too challenging to work with. They are willing, especially in this environment, when you open an opportunity for them to expand their services capability without a significant capital commitment, they are willing to work. And that is proven in what has been accomplished in Springfield, Missouri, with CenturyLink serving as the anchor tenant on the utility's 1,000-mile fiber network. What's also very relevant about that build is that that is not CenturyLink's traditional territory. This marks the first time an ILEC is effectively crossing the Rubicon and competing into AT&T's territory. It's a great thing for the city of Springfield, Missouri, and quite honestly, it's a great thing for the industry. And what that approach is, the utility lease model, as detailed here, the utility constructs their network for their own internal operational needs. They have to put this fiber in their network regardless. There might be some utilities on this webinar knowing that you need that communication infrastructure for you to modernize your grid. Now the opportunity to take that fiber, take what is typically a cost center, turn it into a revenue generating asset while meeting the connectivity needs of your region is a real positive structure. Leasing access to a qualified service provider. I emphasize the term qualified. You want to make sure whatever service provider you have has the financial wherewithal to meet the financial commitments that they sign up for. It is then the tenant or tenants that provide the services to the homes and businesses, allowing the utility or the city, it could very well be the city that builds out that infrastructure, allow them to focus on their core competency, and again, not moving into a new competitive business. And then finally, citywide growth is achieved. I'm hearing a bit of an echo. Next slide, please. So now what? What can you as a utility, you as a city, do in terms of planning to achieve the connectivity needs of your area? Next slide, please. First, we would explore the interests of an electric utility, whether that's a city-owned utility, an IOU, potentially a co-op. What are their interests or needs in deploying more fiber in your network? Or as a city, what are your needs to deploy more fiber in your network for your own internal operational needs? What is your existing infrastructure that you have available to you and your ability to build out a fiber network? What are the regulatory constraints? Do you have access to poles? Do you have the right to connect fiber to poles? Of course, being the most efficient way to build out these networks is aerial, but that is often a gating issue. It is often a surprise when an entity realizes they don't have capacity to attach to poles, or the ready and pole are costs. You want to get an understanding of what infrastructure you have available that you can leverage, what conduit you might have available, and then importantly, what is your ability to utilize the poles. You want to design a network expansion plan that in the case of a utility meets your grid modernization requirements. If you're a city, it might be the internal operations of your city or providing better connectivity to anchor institutions, schools, libraries, police, fire. Designing a network to, again, first and foremost, meeting your needs. Then finding a qualified anchor tenant that might be interested in leasing access to your network to provide the needed business and residential connectivity needs. Next slide, please. We talk a lot about fiber. Oftentimes, if you're not following this industry closely, the logical answer is you guys are talking a whole bunch about wires. We're living in an increasingly wireless world. What gives? You sound like a dinosaur. I think if you're on this webinar, you might have heard many times before that high quality wireless connectivity does not happen on its own. It requires more fiber in a network. All the promises of 5G will not occur if a city or a region does not have a plan to put more fiber in their network that can then serve those towers and small cells to then distribute that signal wirelessly. Next slide, please. I acknowledge I'm talking fast, but hopefully the structure is being understood. We believe that this model effectively changes the math, a term that was first coined by Blair Levin, the lead author of the FCC's National Broadband Plan, who took the position that broadband networks will not be improved until the cost-benefit analysis can be changed to where more benefit can be achieved with lower costs. The ability for a city or utility to deploy that infrastructure and then make it available to qualified service provider or service providers effectively achieves that challenge. Next slide, please. And I see I'm almost finishing up, Heather. I will stay on track as you properly instructed. But the utility lease model and cities and utilities becoming proactive in improving the connectivity needs, the connectivity future for their businesses and residents, for economic development, for access to healthcare, to access to education. It's no longer seen in only small, isolated rural environments. The digital divide exists as much in downtown of tier 1 and tier 2, tier 3 cities as it does in the most rural parts of this country. Having a proactive plan in place is important. It's becoming more and more relevant, and we are pleased that we have hopefully found an approach here that can resonate for many on this call as something to consider to meet those connectivity needs. Next slide. Thank you.
Thanks, Jeff. Chris, walk us through the importance of the back office in software and getting service up and running.
Sure, thanks, Heather. Thanks for the invitation to be on the panel today. So Chris Beisner with ETI. As Heather just alluded to, we are a BSS OSS vendor that services this marketplace. We have been for years, predominantly known for doing service activation on fiber network gear for a variety of different telephone companies and utility companies. Next slide, please. So let's talk a little bit about Broadband for a minute. So not that there's anything all that revelatory here on this screen, but you know, Jason and Jeff have both kind of talked a little bit about this already. But you know, what happened back in March? We saw a big shift in infrastructure pressures, right? We went away from infrastructure on roads and airports and mass transit to a pressure on networks. As you know, kids in schools all of a sudden got sent home and told to do distance learning, and people in offices like myself and most of you got sent home to work from home. So there was a big change that happened in March and April. Jason had the statistic of 30%, and what we're seeing is the same thing, right? If you look at some of the across the industry, 30% increase in upstream traffic, 20% increase in downstream traffic. Those are huge numbers, and it happened almost overnight. It's I think if we look at that collectively, we can appreciate what that means and what's happening, and now the importance of the network. So if we go to the next slide, I borrowed from Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and I kind of retooled it from a telecom point of view, right? So if we look at it from the bottom going up, we have electricity or power, right? The things that enable our devices, our computers, our TVs, our phones. And then we have now high-speed internet. Without that, we can't get to content, and content can be anything. It can be a Zoom meeting or a webinar like this. In one of Jeff's slides, he said that internet is now kind of like the high demand for this generation, and I would agree with that. We can kind of strip everything else out, and if you look at the importance now of networking and network connectivity to us as a civilization, I mean, it's never been more important. So to make the investment in something that's going to sustain the demand for, again, access and content is paramount. So fiber is definitely the way to go. It's been the way to go for a long time. That isn't changing. And even with the new standards coming out around 5G, as Jeff already said, it's a supplemental component to an infrastructure. So we just continue to make those investments, and I think the payback, as Jason alluded to in his presentation, is there. It's kind of a big nut up front. When you look at the lifespan of fiber and how it pays itself back, the dividend is there. You just have to be committed and do it right, and it's happening every day. What we're seeing right now, interestingly enough, is a shift in approach to telecom, where if we went back, say 5-10 years ago, it was all about the triple play. I got to be able to offer data service. I got to be able to offer video service. I got to be able to offer voice service. And in the last couple of years, I've seen video and voice just kind of fall off the table. It's all about quality and speed of network data access, because I can use my cell phone for voice. I can get Hulu or Netflix or Apple TV, but it all hinges upon having that high-speed internet connectivity, right? So, if I'm going to work from home, I have to have that reliable connection, so I can use Zoom or I can use Teams or GoToMeeting. That's kind of where it's at. So if we look forward, go to the next slide. From an ETI point of view, again, fiber's been a real deal now for almost 20 years. Going back to the early aughts, we completed our first fiber integration in 2003, and we've been kind of investing in fiber all along the way. And then now, as we continue forward, XGS-PON is out there, which is real. 10 gig service, SDN, which is all being enabled by fiber and fiber network gear. And then if we start looking out in the future, what's going to happen next? There's a lot happening, and it's just a matter of kind of keeping pace with change and knowing that change is inevitable. But one thing that's constant to all of that, again, is fiber and fiber-based network access. So we're in it for the long term. We don't think it's going to go away, and it's the right strategy and the right move if you're going to be offering telecom for any length of time. Heather?
Thanks, Chris. So next up and our cleanup hitter is Carl Meyerhofer, who will explain how important marketing is to a successful rollout.
Thanks, Heather. So I think what we've heard from all the other panelists is, fiber is really the network technology of the future, and it's almost a de facto standard today. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the execution. After you have, your fiber network in place, how do you go about executing on your business? So next slide. One of the things that is typically overlooked, and I think any of you that have built a network from scratch can attest to, is in the very beginning of the process, it's very overwhelming, right? And it's more about just getting the network built, keeping up with the demand, and getting the service out to the customers. But what I want to highlight is the importance of marketing throughout the entire cycle of your business, even from the very infancy of it. And what I've identified here is just maybe 5 key reasons why you need to be thinking about marketing throughout the entire process. So number 1 I have on here is education. And the reason why I put that on here is right at the very beginning, when you're just starting to roll out your network, you really need to be educating your community. You need to be educating your team members. There's a tremendous amount of education that is required at the early stages of this process. It's critical because you have to get buy-in from your community. You need to get buy-in from your team. So education is one of those elements of marketing that is so critical in the beginning. And then since you're probably going to be a brand new operator, brand awareness is really important as well. For many of you that are on this call today, you're probably an electric cooperative or maybe a municipality or someone that is not typically used to operating in a competitive environment and need to have your brand recognized with your potential customers. So really focus in the beginning of understanding what is the brand promise that you're going to be making, what does your brand stand for, and make sure that your marketing efforts are continuously reinforcing those through the entire process. Then the next stage you're going to get to, right, is customer acquisition, because you don't have a business if you don't have any customers. So your main focus at that stage of the process is making sure that you are acquiring customers at a rate that is going to meet your business plan goals. And as Jeff can probably attest to, right, as you go through those feasibility studies and business plans, customer acquisition and hitting your penetration rates is probably the most critical element of having a successful business. So customer acquisition is key, and marketing plays such an important role there. And then once you've got your network up and running, you have a significant amount of customers, now you're really looking at how do you optimize your network. And when you're optimizing your network and optimizing your service plans, upsell opportunities, right? Being able to use data and analytics to be able to see what are the upsell opportunities in your network and how can you make sure that the customer experience is the best it possibly can be. And then last, churn reduction. Obviously, those of you that have been in business understand that it's a lot less expensive to try to keep a customer than to go acquire a new one. So make sure that you're using that data and analytics to assure that you're reducing your churn as much as possible. Next slide. So what are we looking at here, right? Marketing is really critical to achieving and exceeding your business plan goals. So please make sure that you're taking it into consideration when you're doing your business planning early on. Next slide. So one of the biggest challenges for a marketer, right, is getting attention and cutting through all the noise out there. As all of you have experienced, right, with this COVID-19 virus, we're being over marketed to now. The number of webinars, informational sessions, because people can't meet face to face, everybody is trying to reach out digitally. So as a marketer, you have to be really creative in your approaches and make sure that you're able to cut through the noise. And that's one of the biggest challenges. Next slide. So where is the opportunity, right? The opportunity is in data and analytics today. So my background is educated as an engineer, and I operate now, work in the field of marketing. And today, marketing is really a hybrid blend of science and art. So using data and analytics as a marketer is absolutely essential to your success. Next slide. So at Calix, you know, what we believe in is really focusing on that ultimate customer experience. If you focus on assuring that your customers are having the most fantastic experience with their broadband connection, that's going to be the key to your success. So all of your marketing campaigns need to be focused on that. It really needs to be the focus of your entire organization, making sure that the customer experience is as great as it possibly can be. Next slide. And how do you assure that, right? I mentioned earlier that data and analytics are really important. Well, there's a tremendous amount of data that's actually trapped inside of your network today. You as a service provider have access to a huge amount of data about the habits of your subscribers, how they're using your service, what services they're finding most value in, what are the peak times that they're using the service. So really accessing and utilizing the data that's available to you as a marketer is unbelievable today as a service provider. Next slide. So what I want to do now is just spend a little bit of time to explain to you the types of information that are available to you. Next slide. When you look at the typical residential home, okay, the ability, so if you're using Calix equipment, Calix gear, you have access to all of this information, and you can really tell from the data usage whether you have people that are working from home, whether you have people that are streamers, gamers, person who uses a lot of Internet of Things, IoT equipment in their homes. So through the data analytics, you can determine what service level and what package for your service is actually optimized for that particular individual residence. And traditionally, marketers had information like address, location, maybe income, maybe some demographics about the home. But it's amazing when you take that next level of data down and you're actually seeing how people are interacting with your service, the amount of insight that you can gain, and how then you can custom tailor your packages and also your network design, really, to assure that you're providing that ultimate customer experience. Next slide. So once you have all this data and once you have all this information, how do you operationalize it, right? So at Calix, we recognize that municipalities, electric cooperatives, other organizations may not be the best marketers in the world. So what we've done is we've aggregated information from across all of our service provider customers, and we've helped probably over about 180 communities like yourself actually turn up and operate one of these broadband networks. So we have a tremendous amount of knowledge and information spread out across the country where we extract that information back and we determine what are some of the biggest bang for your buck marketing opportunities with customers. So we take the data that's gathered, we analyze it, and then we create marketing materials. So at Calix, we actually have the ability for you to tap into a whole host of marketing materials that we create given the data that we receive back from our customers and data points. Next slide. So with this market activation campaign, we provide all kinds of templates for emails, social media campaigns, banner ads, postcards, print ads, all across the board. And all of this can be accessed through our Calix database. So obviously you can see that what we're really focused on is making sure that the service you're providing is getting the value from the customer that you deserve. And we really try to put that service provider first and make sure that their customers recognize that you're not just the data pipe that's coming into the home. You're a part of their entire customer experience in the home. And that with the right service at the right levels, you can have that fantastic experience, and all that positive brand attribution goes right to you, the service provider. So with that, Heather, I will turn it back to you. Thank you.
Great. Well, I think this was a fabulous presentation. It shows a sort of soup to nuts on getting new networks built. So let me launch into some questions here. Were all of you surprised by the sudden increase in demand for services and products as a result of the COVID onset? And has it made you at all wary about over-investing or getting ahead of your skis here? And I'm going to ask Jason to go first because he's the one right on the front line.
Surprised at the increase? No. You know, it had to happen. It was the only way you're going to be able to shut down a country and still be able to teach kids how to and work and not completely destroy the economy. So was it a big thing for ramping up fast? That was definitely our biggest challenge, was how can we sustain, and were we going to have to sustain a increase to it? We try to be very proactive in our network management, and we approved, I think, $100,000 in upgrades in a matter of 2 days that usually we would take a couple months to do, and ran out and got them done right away just to be able to take on the increase in demand that we took. So we were prepped for it. Luckily, we got ahead of the equipment issues that came later with supply chain issues. But
others on the panel, how have you been surprised by the surge, and have you been at all nervous about getting too far ahead?
Heather, I could take a quick stab at that. You know, we did see a significant surge in demand. To Jason's point, right? I don't think it was really a surprise, understanding the massive shift in lifestyle that was taking place. But quite honestly, at Calix, what we arrived at is that we've had this projection, or this curve, right, of this continuous increase in bandwidth demand and the speed at which applications get adopted for work from home applications and things like that. And I think that really what we did is we took a chunk out of the time frame of the curve, right? We just did a little more of a step function. We were going to get there eventually, but I think it just was a little bit of a pull-in is what we see. And the expectation, when you say, are we concerned about it maybe dropping off? I think there are some significant changes that have taken place that are going to stick. And while I don't see things returning completely back to normal, maybe they'll tail off a little bit, but for the most part, it's a pull forward of what we kind of predicted was going to be the future eventually. I don't know if others feel the same way.
Chris, Jeff?
What surprised me was not so much, again, how fast it happened, but how successful it really was. Again, that transition happened within like almost hours. And you consider all the kids that got, sent home from school, even, my son in middle school, they set him up with teams to do distance learning, and it worked. If we had done this 5 years ago, I don't think it would have been as successful. I think a big reason for that was because the amount of fiber that's been put in the ground already. If we were relying on a copper network, this never would have happened.
Right.
I think from the markets that we get exposure to, home builders and home buyers, when thinking about economic development, the importance of the home office, home builders are now making a home office now a part of the core design standard of new builds. Of course, no home office is complete without a proper broadband connection. And with the proper fiber broadband connection, working from home or in the corporate office can be almost indistinguishable. and hopefully, sometime soon we're back to being more in our corporate offices. But the idea of the acceptance and just the normalcy of working from home, at least part-time, is going to remain. Another increase that we have seen that the broadband group we've been talking about and floating and hearing interest of is telehealth services. The idea was, well, isn't that really focused on a senior demographic? There's a discomfort in maybe communicating healthcare over broadband services. Well, it's not only a single demographic, it's families with young children. And in this environment, especially now more than ever, where the idea of going into a physician's office and being exposed to potential air that you don't want to be exposed to, and being able to have your son or daughter, yourself, or whomever access medical attention is obviously of high demand now. And it's demonstrated that markets are not efficient when it comes to the broadband space, and that city leaders, whether developers or utilities, need to plan proactively in order to provide that equitable access to healthcare, education, and economic development.
Yeah, and I would refer all of the people on the call to our telehealth virtual learning that we did last month to hear some discussion on how that's been implemented and some of the legal and confidential requirements that have slowed it. It's just not a matter of getting the right broadband out there, unfortunately, but we've seen very positive results in the telehealth market. Are any of you all involved in the RDOF effort in the auction? Are you worried about funding for the new demand? Now, what are you seeing there?
I don't. So worried about funding. Obviously, we're trying to fund our own network. So yeah, we're always worried about funding. But as in participation for RDOF, our area does not qualify for a lot of the way they built it, and it's really nervous on the serviceable locations where some areas I picked in our area. There's a couple of spots that are available in our area that they say there's 4 serviceable locations and there's 1 barn. It's not even, and it's all part of, it's a different census tract, but it's a different part of the, it's the same farm. So it makes you nervous to, okay, if you have to supply 100%, but there's not 100% to supply, how does that work? And so those are some of the things we're weighing in doing it. I think we're going to try, but I don't know how well we're going to go beyond for us. So
you don't see it as a panacea?
No.
Okay. Anybody else have clients involved in that?
Federal grant programs are not new. They're important and they certainly can be helpful, but they can be challenging in terms of putting together a successful grant, managing that grant, and then of course achieving what it is that you stated that you would do. And again, it's not to say that one should be discouraged from going that direction, but at the Broadband Group, working with municipalities and utilities that are not becoming broadband service providers, they want to qualify for RDOF. So we currently aren't going after that program. Look, it's going to help, but a panacea, was Chris who mentioned it? The OpEx of operating these networks is often higher than what is traditionally anticipated. Solutions like ETI and with Calix's support can be more achievable, but single one-time cash infusions aren't necessarily going to lead to sustainable deployment of broadband networks, unfortunately.
The other thing to consider too is that sometimes we look back at CAF. I mean, that had a big implication on companies' general ledger and how they did accounting, which I don't think a lot of people who took CAF money realized until later in the game. So you got to be leery of that kind of stuff and what impact is that going to have? I mean, the cash sounds attractive on the one hand, but what impact is that going to have on your business and your accounting on the back end?
Interesting. Jason, you talked about accelerating your CapEx quickly, going from 2 months to 2 weeks. How did you get that expansion? Did you have to hire up, or how did you get it all done?
No, we just dropped some of the other projects that we were working on and put them on hold. We didn't drop them, we put them on hold temporarily so we could refocus and get the efforts done. Our main focus for those 2 months, March and April, was hook up as many customers as we could hook up that needed our services. And it was heavily weighted towards school families. If you had kids in school that needed online connectivity, you were first in line. And then we went to business, people that needed it for homework. And we asked the questions when people called, why are you signing up with us? And then prioritize based off of that. And then, my network team it was all hands on deck. We pulled a couple projects and just started working hard to get through and get that done.
Do you have a subsidy program for low income, and is that a big part of your service area?
Yeah, so I actually started a subsidy program years ago when I owned a company in West Yellowstone, and we spun that program up in 24 hours here. We service 8 different school districts we gave out 2 free months, and then it's low cost, $15 a month service, perpetual from there on. So we started the program up to continue it forever, we took a little bit of time to spin it up, and we wanted to make sure it was right. And we serviced quite a few families, took advantage of that. They have to be picked by their school. They can't just call and get on the program. They have to be hand selected by the school district, but it's worked really well, and we've helped out a lot of people along the way. So
That's great. And what percentage of your subscribers would you put in that classification?
Less than 1%.
Oh, okay. Good. Jeff, can you always find a utility that's interested in investing? And I also noticed that you've done primarily 2nd and 3rd tier markets. Is this a model that would work in rural areas as well?
It can, and I don't want to overstate its ability to be served in all markets. We often say this is not an off-the-shelf approach. Nothing in the broadband industry is, as anybody who's ventured into it understands. With a utility building out the fiber network, taking on all that capital cost, even if you remove any lease payments or capital payments by a service provider, the OpEx of serving that community might still be a gating issue in terms of a utility in a rural area being able to find an anchor tenant. So you need to consider those costs when exploring the opportunity for a utility lease model. Mobilizing, getting the truck rolls for a service provider, there's still significant operating costs there. So there's certainly no shortage in terms of the utilities that are exploring this, for the reason that, again, they need to put fiber in the co-ops that are on this call. No, you need to put more fiber in your network for your own internal operational needs. This turns a cost center into a revenue generating asset. Huntsville, Alabama, Springfield, Missouri, they both happen to be city-owned electric utilities. However, that is simply by, I guess, by coincidence. It certainly can be replicated from the largest electric utilities in the country to co-ops, depending on the density and the population of that area, and what service providers might be there or might be willing to be able to cost effectively move into your market to be an anchor tenant.
Very interesting. So Chris and Carl, what are the characteristics of your newest customer base? Are they incumbents looking to expand, or are they primarily first-time providers desperate for service? How would you characterize them? Carl?
Sure, I'll go first. So I'm a little bit biased, right, just based on the market responsibility that I have with Calix. Calix serves telephone companies, cable operators, and then the segment that I cover is more of those new greenfield providers. So from my exposure, it's new entities, whether it's a municipality or an electric utility that is getting into fiber and getting into broadband. So that is probably one of our fastest growing segments, though, in the company, because as this pandemic has proven, right, that this is a critical service, and you just can't live a lifestyle without significant broadband connectivity. So we have seen even an uptick since this pandemic of interest in new service providers building out networks.
And Chris, what about your new customers?
So we've seen incumbents doing expansions, putting more fiber in, basically, doubling down. I've seen traditional cable companies, HFC companies, who've started to really, now make a change in direction and start looking to deploy fiber. That's something that's kind of net new. And I've also seen new entrants to the market that, again, kind of have a different business model than we've seen in the past, right? It's not about triple play. It's about, going all in with fiber and a very limited number of data services. It could be 3, 4, I got a 150 meg, 500 meg, and a 1 gig service. And that's all I offer, right? That's it. With, credit card billing. Keep the number of choices limited and don't worry about the video and the voice, and just, again, stay focused. So, but, the common denominator in all that is fiber. I see that over and over again.
So what kind of market are you getting the most demand from? Is it primarily rural, exurban, or suburban?
It's all over the place. A lot of the rural communities have been underserved for years by the incumbents, so they're desperate for better connectivity, as we've talked about throughout the call. Broadband has become kind of a must-have, not a luxury, and that I think that's a big reason why we see municipalities go down that fiber path, right? They just need to do something that's going to enable their constituents to have that kind of connectivity. So that's a big driver.
And Carl, would you agree with that? You're seeing all demographics on your new builds?
Yes, we are. And I think some of the change that we've seen is that the technology progression, the business models have allowed communities that were considered too rural to actually justify a build. So we're seeing the threshold, the bottom threshold of density continuously drop as technology progresses and as business practices, deployment methodology changes. We're starting to see the availability of fiber networks into very rural communities really be viable.
So let me just give you all my last question, and we'll go in order. We'll start with Chris, and then Jason and Carl and Jeff, and then we'll be ready for Craig to wrap us up. What would be the one thing you would recommend to any community desperate for fiber broadband right now? Chris.
Talk to people who've done it first. There's a lot of experience out there, and capitalize on it. Don't try to blaze the trail on your own. Companies like Just the Broadband Group and others, have a lot of that know-how and can keep you out of the weeds. There's a lot of ways you can do it wrong. So don't make that mistake. Get the help, and it'll pay dividends in the long run.
Jason?
Yeah, exactly what Chris said is attend some shows when we get back to where we can attend some shows, and ask those questions. Find the neighboring community that's near you that has done it or is researching it, and even talk to some. You probably have a small local provider that's willing to jump in and help you do it, even if there may be bad relationship from the past. That could be good now, and it's always good to ask that question of what they're willing to do, and have a list of people of customers that are willing to sign up with that new fiber that's coming by.
Carl.
I guess I'll just pile on the theme, right? And that is, this doesn't have to be a new experience, right? This doesn't have to be blazing a trail. There's a lot of really successful networks out there that have learned a lot. So take advantage of that. and don't try to reinvent the wheel. It's not necessary, right? It's just learn what's proven, use what's proven success, and lean on those in the industry that have the experience that have gotten others there.
And Jeff, you get the last word here.
Well, it's a common theme, and I think it's because there's the experience on this webinar that this industry introduces far greater opportunities for failure than it does for success. And I think from all of our perspectives, we know that the growth of our market, really the only thing that can inhibit it at this point are going to be failed initiatives, putting a chilling effect across the industry. So understanding what the risks are going forward with a structured and disciplined strategy is something that I think we would all endorse, and knowing that the challenges, they certainly can be addressed, but they must be understood and considered.
Great. Craig, I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Heather, and thanks to all of our guest panelists today. A great discussion, a phenomenal topic, and it is something that I think we can all feel good about, knowing that this industry is part of the solution to solving the challenges as we go forward. And so glad that you all could spend time with us today. Again, we remind you to be sure to visit our website for future topics on our continuing learning series. And on behalf of the Broadband Bunch and ETI, I'm Craig Corbin. Thanks for letting us be a part of your day. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.